Thanks, Tyler. Just to reiterate what Tyler said, thank you so much for coming this morning. We're really excited and glad that you're here. We are going to be in 1 Timothy chapter 6 this morning. 1 Timothy chapter 6. So if you've been trekking with us throughout this series, we've been going through 1 Timothy, living in light of the gospel, and really what that means spiritually, what that means practically, what that looks like on a day-to-day basis and on our spiritual walk with each other as a church as a whole. And as you're turning to 1 Timothy chapter 6, I just want to go ahead and open up with a question, an open question. Nobody answer out loud or raise any hands or anything like that, but just to kind of get your wheels turning and thinking about what I think is the intent of this passage. And that question is this: at what point in your life, or where in your life, were you the most content? When in your life were you the most content? When did you feel, the least amount of pressure to keep up with or to do better than or to have more than anybody or a certain person or a particular set of people or something like that? When did you feel the least amount of pressure there or felt the most content in your life? A couple of weeks ago, I was talking with my wife. I had a proposition for her. It was really only just about 2 weeks ago. I came to her, and we are currently moving from our old apartment to our new apartment, and I have a project that I'd really like to start at our new apartment, but as we've been married, we haven't really acquired a whole lot of tools. In fact, the only tools that we do have are owned by her, or what she brought into the marriage, which makes me look terrible. But I wanted to gather some tools for this particular project, and so I came to her and I said, hey babe, I'd really like to go ahead and invest in maybe an electric drill or a circular saw, a skill saw to be able to use in this project. And her response to me was, oh, you don't got to do that. I mean, my dad already has all of those. I mean, you can just let us borrow it and then you can give it back to him when we're done and we don't have to spend any money. She's practical, that's how she thinks. And then Mr. Consumer over here, I was like, yeah, but then I won't have it, right? Then that won't be mine. She's like, yes, it will. You will borrow it, use it, and then give it back to my dad. Yeah, but then I won't have it. I mean, this is kind of how I thought. And so she talked me into it. Yeah, we're going to borrow the tools. It'll be fine. But here's the thing. I worked for my father-in-law for an entire summer before asking for my wife's hand in marriage. That was kind of the plan. And so as I was working for him, I got to know his tools. And my father-in-law's skill saw could really be the original skill saw. This thing it's older and it's a little bit, greasy and oily, and it's not really, it's just not new. It's not the shiny new things. It doesn't have the best guard on the saw for it. And this isn't because he doesn't have the money for it. I mean, my father-in-law has done really well for his life and for his family, and he's got the money for it. But the generation that he comes from says, if it's not broke, don't upgrade. If it's not broke, you don't need to replace it. And if it is broke, just fix it. You don't have to go out and buy a new one. I think a lot of people can attest to that. My parents are that way. Your parents might be that way, but that's just his generation. Like when I looked at the saw that summer that I worked for him, and I saw kind of the dullness of the blade, he's not one to go out and buy a new blade. He's one to sharpen each individual tooth on the old blade just because that's his mentality. That's the generation that he comes from. And I'm thinking, Paul, just take this to, Home Depot, go to Sears, go to Home Depot or wherever you can buy a new one. What is a new saw blade? Like 15, 20 bucks, and you sharpened the old one. Because that's the disconnect between his generation and my generation. My generation is what I really like to call the upgrade generation. And I think a lot of us can attest to that. That word upgrade, it's a technical term that's kind of become the icon, if you will, to our generation. And if you think about it, even look at all the cell phone companies and all the cell phone plans going on right now. They're all having to break their contracts or uncontract us or give us the next plan because people want to upgrade their phones like 3 times a year. And I'm not speaking to our congregation or our people like I don't do this. Like, this is my iPhone 6, new iPhone. I like it. It's a good thing. And I'm not saying that upgrading is, necessarily bad. I'm not saying that having new tools is necessarily bad. But what this is saying about our current culture, or what companies are really having to do to cater to our current culture right now, I think is pointing to something a little more severe than we might acknowledge at first. And I think 1 Timothy chapter 6 is kind of drawing that out. Something that was written 2,000 years ago, I think is drawing that out a little bit for you and for me and for our culture to kind of understand if it's not bad to upgrade, it's not bad to have new or nice or shinier, but if that becomes our orientation, if our orientation in life is more, I got to have the newer, I'm content until my awareness shows someone else's who's better than mine, and I got to upgrade to that. If we kind of live there in that environment, there are consequences, whether we know it or not, whether we're conscious to it or not, there are consequences that we're going to have to pay for that, financially, in our marriages, in our relationships, in our friendships. And that might sound kind of extreme, and you're like, well, that's a little too far over the edge, Josh. But I think what 1 Timothy chapter 6 paints for us today kind of envelops that idea that there are consequences, there are traps that we can step into when our orientation toward life is just more or better or upgrade. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with our generation or my father-in-law's generation, but having this idea as we approach the text, I think, is necessary to understand or lay a foundation for the whole of it. So in light of that, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to 1 Timothy chapter 6 this morning. Something incredibly interesting about our text today. There's actually a couple phrases in our text. This is really neat. There's a couple of phrases in our text where we actually hear them tossed around a lot in our culture. And a lot of times I don't think people even realize those phrases are from the Bible. A lot of times people don't even realize those were written 2,000 years ago, even for where we're at today. And one of those phrases in particular happens at the very end of our text today. And I want to do kind of something that's not very popular, or people are like, you're not supposed to do it that way. But if you just bear with me, I would actually like to read the last verse in our text and then go back to the first verse, because I think it lays such a solid and such a good foundation and really just connotes this whole idea of what the text is about, and we can better approach the rest of the text that way. If you'll just bear with me, go ahead and go from 1 Timothy chapter 6 all the way down to verse 10. Our verses today are 1 Timothy 6, 2 to 10. I want to go ahead and start at verse 10. So this is what it says. Paul says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Now, we've heard that before, and we hear it tossed around in culture before. You've probably said it, I've said it, but what does that really mean? Like, what does it look like to see, the love of money in the mirror? What is that? Like, if I sat down with each individual person here across from the table and I just asked you, or you asked me, hey, do you love money? Do you right now in your lifestyle and how you exemplify your finances, do you love money? Your answer, if you allow me to speak for you, might not be this, but I'm guessing it would be this, is no, Josh, I don't love money. But we date sometimes. Or no, I'm not in love with money, but I like money. I mean, I'm not in love with it, but I have a little affinity for it. I mean, we kind of have this lifestyle that might say contrary to that answer. And if we really think about it, let me change the tables a little bit as we're thinking about this love for money. Think back to a time where you were just head over heels crazy about someone. Head over heels just in love with this person. Maybe you ended up marrying this person. Maybe you ended up, you didn't stay with this person, and I'm sorry about that. But just think about this time where you were absolutely crazy about this person. There are all kinds of stories we can look back on and think about. Like, I've heard stories of people, they haven't seen each other all summer, so they drive like 50 or 100 miles just to see each other for like 15 minutes. Then they have to drive back, and it's just crazy scenarios like that where you say, I did it, it's crazy, but I was in love, and that's why I did it. Or, I heard a story about this guy. He got a poster board and he climbed up this tree just to show in front of a girl's dorm room window, just to show her this poster board, and it was raining and thundering and she wasn't even there. She was at home, and it was sad, but he did it. We just do these things because we're head over heels crazy about this person, and we can measure how much we like them, or we can measure how in love we are by the sacrifices that we did for that person. Now let me change the tables back a little bit. Can we think about the crazy sacrifices or the crazy things that we did financially? Can we think back to the times where we just sat down with our budget, our monthly budget, or we saw this new thing, this better thing that What we have is fine. My phone might be fine. It definitely didn't just all of a sudden break when I wanted the upgrade. It worked fine, but I still wanted the upgrade. And so I sat down with my budget. If I can just squeeze $25 more out of my budget per month, I can get on this plan, or I can have this lease, or I can have this car. And can we think about the crazy things maybe that we have done in the past to attain something that now looking back wasn't really all that worth it to attain? And we can measure the sacrifices that we made to have those things, and then revisit the question, am I in love with money? Am I in love with what money gives me, or the gain that money gives me? And I think this is that idea that Paul is talking about, and that will be exemplified in this text, are the appetites that we have and the appetites that we example in our lifestyles, even though we say, no, I'm not in love with money, or I'm not in love with whatever money gives me. In light of that, if we can go ahead and go back to the first part of our text. This is 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting at verse 3. Mark finished us up to verse 2 the last time that we were here. So starting at verse 3, I actually think just to start today, if we can go ahead and read 3, 4, and 5 in our groups, and then work through just a couple of questions to really get an understanding for where in the world is Paul coming from, what is he talking about here, and then come back and revisit what we talked about, what we discussed afterward, and continue on. So if you can read 3, 4, and 5 in your groups, answer a couple of questions, and we'll be right back. All right, well, as we kind of start coming back together as a big group, and as you've trekked through those texts, I'm hearing a lot of good discussion. I'm sorry to call it short, but that's just the environment and the culture of our group to get both sides. And so if we can trek through just a couple of verses that you've read together real quick, there's something that I really want to tease out a little bit that I think Paul hits on the head and really communicates what we're talking about here, or really the opposite of what we're talking about here. Look at, if you will, with me at verse 4. Paul says, they are conceited and understand nothing. They have an unhealthy interest, or maybe your translation says unhealthy craving, or something of that sort. They have an unhealthy interest in controversies and quarrels about words that produce envy, slander, etc., etc. These are interests, or if we can just put them all together, all the different translations together, and go ahead and label these appetites. Unhealthy appetites about gossip, about drama, about different things that we go through and different things that we might be drawn to, even in a bad way. But there are appetites here. And if I can just kind of label what an appetite is for a second, or communicate what it is to have an appetite. An appetite is something that is never fully and finally satisfied. That's an appetite. So like you're going to go home later this evening, you're going to have dinner because of your hunger, which is natural, and then you'll be full, but you will not be fully and finally full, because you're later on tonight or tomorrow morning going to have an appetite again. I mean, we all know this. That's just how it works. And what Paul is communicating here is these people, these false teachers, these people who are not in line with Scripture, in line with what God is teaching through Paul, have redirected their appetites to something that produces consequences, that produces envy, that produces slander, that produces a lot of things that we don't want to produce. And what he's going to try to get to, and what we're hopefully going to try to get to, is if we can just somehow redirect our appetite, or if we can just somehow redirect our hunger for contentment, or our hunger for satisfaction, to find something that is ultimately satisfying, to find something that will give us full contentment, and not, all this drama or gossip or whatever we go through, whether it's that or financial gain or anything like that. And Paul starts to talk about what that is. So in verse 6, he says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. And there's our word again, contentment. And great gain here is in contrast to what many of us know here as great gain. What you and I in our culture think about when we think about great gain is, I traded my box TV for a plasma TV. Or, my 401k, I could live to be 120. In my 401k, I would be fine. I would be set. I don't have to worry about that. That's great gain to us most of the time, if we're serious and we think about great gain. But what Paul is communicating here, and this is really important, everybody look up here for a second, this is huge. If we miss this, we really missed it. What Paul is communicating here, and the reason why great gain has more to do with your relationship with God than it does with your relationship with stuff, is because when you die, you can't take stuff with you. So if you were born with nothing, you have some things for a while, and then you die with nothing, we had no great gain. Does that make sense? What Paul is communicating here, why great gain has more to do with your relationship with God, is because when you die, what determines whether or not you have great gain is your relationship with God. And where you end up, what you gained for a lot longer than you will be here on earth. This is why great gain is pictured as a spiritual factor and not just a financial factor, or not just a gainful possession or something along those lines. As he continues, for we brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. And when I say when we have food and clothing, we can be content with that, if we're honest, something from you and something from me says, no, we won't. No, we won't be content with that. I won't. If I just have something to wear, and if I'm just full, I'm not content with that. And what Paul is doing here is he's going to an extreme to communicate something invaluable. And if you think back to the beginning of this lesson, I asked you a question. I said, when in your life were you most content? Can you pinpoint in your life when you were most content? Now let's think about that answer. In our life, more often than not, where you're at right now, you have more than you've ever had before, at least since you moved away from mom and dad. You have right now more than anything you've ever acquired in the past, because common sense says the more you grow, the more time goes on, the more you acquire. If the answer to I was most content in my life when I had whatever I wanted, when I had the most possessions, when I had the most money, if that is the answer, then that would be right now, probably. But if you're a Christian, you know that's not really the answer. If you're a Christian, you understand that I was most content in my life when I was where God wanted me to be, doing what God wanted me to do, and the way that God wanted me to do it. I was representing Him, and I was manifesting the gifts that I had through His Spirit and what He has given me to do kingdom work, not for my gain. I wasn't thinking about how can I get it, how can I get it. I was thinking about how other people can get it and how I might be able to meet it with what I have. Instead of sitting down with my budget and saying, how can I squeeze $25 more out a month just to get this plan, thinking, okay, if the $25 is there, how can I meet someone else's needs? And all of a sudden, when we realized that that's where we were the most content, was when we were doing what God really wanted us to do and worrying about, maybe it's not about me anymore, it's about other people, we're getting a little bit of a picture of what godliness looks like. And all of a sudden, what Paul is communicating here starts to make sense, that godliness with contentment is great gain. And he continues, he says, those who want to get rich, or those who want to live richly, fall into temptation and a trap, into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. And what Paul is communicating here is, if you want to live richly, those of us who want to get rich, who want more, the reality is there is a ceiling to our finances. There is a ceiling to our budget. And those who want to get more or go beyond that or try to go beyond that, this is a promise. This isn't a warning. You will fall into a trap. Those of us here today who have a credit card amount that we cannot pay, we fell into that trap. Those of us today who have a really nice car, but we don't like the car because the lease is killing us, fell into that trap. This is what Paul is trying to communicate. He's saying, hey, don't play around with this. You don't get into a cage with a bear and say, I'm going to be careful. You just stay away from the cage. Paul is saying, don't have that mindset. If you can redirect your contentment from just more, or I need to have this or else I'm not satisfied, you're going to fall into a trap. That's what he's communicating here. And then we have the verse that we started with in the beginning. He says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." Some people eager for money. Can you think of a time when you've been eager for something? Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and have pierced themselves with many pains and many griefs. This is something that probably hits home to a couple of people more than others, just because we've lived longer, or just because we've earned those battle scars and understand really what Paul is trying to communicate here. But whether you've gone through it or you haven't gone through it, this is a serious situation. And what Paul is warning here is a serious situation. And if we're honest, I think that we come here this morning, or you come here this morning, not to be comfortable. I think you come here to grow. Not just to grow yourself, but to grow with others. And I don't think that you come here this morning just to hear something that is true. Hopefully everything we say up here is true. Hopefully you come here to hear something that's not just true, but it's helpful. It helps you grow. It helps you grow with others. And it helps us avoid these traps and progresses our spiritual life in a way that brings God glory. And in order for it to be helpful, that takes effort from both sides. And so what I'd really like right now is for us to answer just 3 questions, just small questions that I've tried to crunch down. Started with a lot, crunched it down, started with a little, crunched it down to just 3 questions that we can walk away in light of this passage. And as you answer these 3 questions as a group, don't think about being comfortable. Think about being helpful. Think about wanting to grow. And the reason why if we're honest, the reason why we really came here to begin with. And so if we can work through these 3 questions, and then we'll come back together afterwards. All right, well, hey, as we start coming back together and winding down here and closing up shop, hopefully you got a lot out of 1 Timothy chapter 6. I know that I did. I loved the time that I got to spend in it. But what I want to talk about right now, as we disperse and kind of get out of here for our week, I have a pizza box right here. And I want to talk for a second about pizza. Now, this doesn't have pizza inside. It did. Yeah, I'm sorry. It used to have pizza. We ordered pizza this week, and it was delicious, and I loved it, and we do it too often, and it was very good. But this is just a regular pizza box, kind of old and a little bit greasy, and I want to talk about it for a second. Because just picture if you went home today, you didn't really feel like cooking dinner, or sometime this week you didn't really feel like cooking dinner, and so you decided to order out, and you get pizza. And the pizza guy shows up to your door, and he's holding the pizza, and you answer the door because you're hungry, and the pizza smells really good, and so he's standing there, and he has the pizza, and while he's holding it, you notice he doesn't have the box. He's just holding the pizza. And the pizza, like the cheese is oozing down his arm, and there's like sauce coming onto the ground, and he's just standing there, and he asks you sincerely, "Hey, did you order this pepperoni pizza?" And he's expecting a tip because he's doing what he thought he should do. And the only thing that you can think about right now is, where is the box? Because this is weird, because you don't know where his hands have been. You don't know what he's been doing. That's just kind of gross. Nobody in their right mind would actually buy that pizza from him. We would do something about it. But I want to talk about that for a minute, because that pizza is probably about $10. The pizza box, I looked it up, it's only about 39 cents. And that's just because of the writing on it, the cost of the ink and all the manufacturing that they did. But this is just cardboard, just 39 cents. But this box becomes invaluable, not because of what it does, but because of the product that is put inside of the box. The box doesn't give worth to the product gives worth to the box. And what I want to just focus on for a minute, this sounds corny and a little silly, but just think about this for a minute. All throughout Scripture, we're talked about being vessels. We're talked about being carriers. We're talked about being boxes. And if we are constantly filled with our intentions, whether we say we're in love with money, whether we say we're in love with stuff or not, if we're constantly filled with self-gain and having the best kind of gain and the best upgrade, we become much harder to be used, or much harder to be, a minister to other people or a blessing to other people. But if we can just focus, if we can just realize that what God asks for us is that we just be clean and that we be empty and that we be ready and that we be satisfied and waiting on Him. If we can just say that today and then reiterate that every single day of our life, that God, I am ready to not run to other things. I'm ready to not be satisfied by my finances. I am ready to be satisfied by You, and I will wait on You. I will wait on Your word. And I think that if we can just live there, if we can stay there with our finances, with our friendships, with our marriages, we will be in a much better position for God to do the extraordinary through us where we're at in ways that we might have been numb to otherwise. In ways where we had been worrying about what can I get next, or what can I squeeze out of my budget next. But if we can be clean and if we can be empty, we can be filled with godliness. And that's the word that Paul keeps talking about. And that's the word that is talked about throughout all of 1 Timothy, and I think is the theme of our relationship with God, is just to be more like Him and to manifest His gifts and His Spirit through us in our interactions with people. And in light of that, I hope that we can just pray for the wisdom to know with what we've done, what to do with 1 Timothy chapter 6, and then really just the courage to do it in our daily lives and our finances. In light of that, let me go ahead and pray for you, and then we'll be out of here. Heavenly Father, that is our prayer, Lord, that we would just wait on You. I thank You so much for Your satisfaction, and I thank You that we were built to be loved by You, God. I thank You so much for every single person in this room, for the message of 1 Timothy. I thank You most of all for Your Son.